Clara had always been the kind of person who faded into the background, not because she wanted to, but because the world seemed louder than she was. At 28, she worked the night shift at St. Marlo's Community Hospital, a modest, slightly worn-down place on the edge of the city, where the paint peeled in the stairwells and the coffee in the break room always tasted like yesterday. But to Clara, it was more than just a job. It was a place where she could be useful without having to be seen. She moved quietly through the halls in her soft-soled shoes, clipboard in hand, checking vitals, adjusting IV lines, offering water with a gentle nod. Patients often mistook her silence for coldness, but those who stayed long enough learned the truth. Clara listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, it was only when it mattered. Her shyness wasn't new. It had been with her since childhood, growing up in a small apartment with her grandmother who'd lost her hearing after a fever when she was young. Back then, no one in their neighborhood knew sign language. Doctors spoke over her. Cashiers ignored her. But Clara had refused to let her grandmother disappear. At 6 years old, she'd checked out a library book on American Sign Language and practiced every night under the kitchen light, her small hands forming clumsy letters until they moved like water. Now, years later, that skill lived quietly inside her, something she rarely used, but never forgot. It was a Tuesday in late October when the rain started. Not the gentle kind, but the kind that drummed hard on the hospital roof and turned the parking lot into a mirror. Clara had just finished her rounds when the charge nurse handed her a new admission file. Room 314, the nurse said, already turning away. Eleanor Whitmore, 81, deaf. Came in with dizziness and fatigue. Family's wealthy, probably won't stay long. Clara nodded, took the file, and walked down the hall. She didn't care about wealth. She'd seen plenty of rich patients come and go. Some kind, some impatient, all used to getting their way. What mattered was that this woman was alone and scared, and couldn't hear the beeping machines or the nurse's reassurances. When Clara pushed open the door to room 314, she found an elderly woman sitting upright in bed, her silver hair neatly pinned back, eyes sharp but tired. She wore a silk robe over her hospital gown, and her hands rested calmly in her lap. But Clara noticed the slight tremor in her fingers. The woman looked up as the door clicked shut, her expression guarded. Clara didn't reach for a notepad or point to her own mouth like others might. Instead, she stepped fully into the room, closed the door softly behind her, and raised her hands. "Hello," she signed. "My name is Clara. I'm your nurse tonight." The woman's eyes widened. For a moment, she just stared, as if she hadn't seen sign language in years. Then slowly a smile broke across her face, warm, relieved, almost tearful. She lifted her own hands, a little stiff at first, but clear. "You sign?" She signed back. "Yes," Clara replied. "My grandmother was deaf. I learned when I was little." The woman, Eleanor, nodded, her shoulders relaxing for the first time since arriving. She signed, "Thank you. Everyone else just writes or shouts. It's exhausting." Clara pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed, keeping her movements slow and calm. She explained the tests they'd run, the IV they'd start, the doctor's plan, all in smooth, clear signs. Eleanor watched her closely, her expression shifting from caution to trust. At one point, she reached out and gently touched Clara's wrist. "You're kind," she signed. Clara felt her cheeks warm. She wasn't used to being seen, let alone praised. "Just doing my job," she said aloud without thinking, then quickly caught herself and signed the same words. Eleanor chuckled silently, her eyes crinkling at the corners. They spent the next hour like that, talking in quiet hands, sharing stories without sound. Eleanor told her about gardening, about losing her husband decades ago, about how lonely it got when people stopped trying to understand her. Clara shared little, just enough to keep the connection alive. She didn't mention her own loneliness, or how she sometimes ate dinner alone in the break room, or how she still missed her grandmother every single day. But in that room, none of that mattered. For the first time in a long while, both of them felt understood. Later, after starting the IV and adjusting the bed, Clara stood to leave. Eleanor signed, "Will you be back?" "Yes," Clara signed back. "I'm on until 7. I'll check on you before I go." Eleanor nodded, already looking more at peace than when she'd arrived. Clara walked out into the hallway, the rain still tapping against the windows. She didn't know it yet, but that small act, choosing to sign instead of write, choosing to sit instead of rush, had already begun to change things in ways she couldn't imagine. What she didn't know was that earlier that evening, a black sedan had pulled into the hospital's private entrance. A man in a dark coat and baseball cap had slipped through the service corridor, avoiding the front desk. He'd asked for his mother's room number in a low voice, then stood outside room 314 for nearly 10 minutes, watching through the small window in the door. He saw Clara sit beside his mother. He saw his mother's face light up, something he hadn't witnessed in years. He saw the way Clara's hands moved with patience and care, how she leaned in when his mother signed, how she didn't look at the clock once. He didn't knock. He didn't introduce himself. He just watched, heart pounding in a way it hadn't since he was a boy, and then quietly walked away. His name was Julian Whitmore. To the world, he was the CEO of Viridian Dynamics, a tech empire worth billions, known for sleek gadgets and ruthless business tactics. To the press, he was cold, distant, a man who cared more about algorithms than people. But standing in that hallway, watching a nurse who didn't even know who he was treat his mother like a human being instead of a burden, he felt something crack open inside him. He'd spent years building walls, around his company, around his emotions, around his guilt. He hadn't visited his mother in over a year, telling himself he was too busy, that she was fine, that the staff would take care of her. But seeing her with Clara, he realized how wrong he'd been. She wasn't fine. She was lonely, and someone had finally reached her. Back in his car, Julian sat in the rain for a long time. He didn't turn on the engine. He just stared at the hospital window, replaying the scene in his mind. He thought about all the times he'd chosen a board meeting over a phone call, a product launch over a visit. He thought about his mother's hands, how they used to braid his hair when he was sick, how they'd signed "I love you" every night before bed when he was small. He hadn't signed back in years. Now, watching a stranger do it with such ease and kindness, he felt ashamed, but more than that, he felt hope. He didn't know Clara's name yet, didn't know her story, her fears, her quiet strength, but he knew one thing: he needed to thank her. Not with money, not with a flashy gesture, but properly, human to human, and he also knew he needed to come back, not as the CEO, not as the billionaire, but as a son. Inside the hospital, Clara finished her shift notes, unaware of the man in the parking lot or the storm of change he carried with him. She thought only of Eleanor, how she'd smiled, how she'd signed good night with a little wave. That was enough for Clara, it always had been. But life, as it often does, had other plans, and sometimes the smallest act of kindness, done without expectation, without an audience, is the one that echoes the loudest. The next evening, the rain had stopped, but the air still held that damp, heavy feeling that clings to city streets after a storm. Inside St. Marlo's, the fluorescent lights hummed softly, casting long shadows down the quiet halls. Clara was back on duty, her scrubs freshly laundered, her hair pulled into a loose bun. She'd thought about Eleanor all day, not in a worried way, but with a quiet warmth, like remembering a good dream. She found herself looking forward to room 314. When she stepped inside, Eleanor was sitting by the window, wrapped in her silk robe, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. She turned as Clara entered, and her face lit up the same way it had the night before. No words were needed, just a smile and a quick sign. "You're here." "Of course, Oman," Clara signed back, setting down her clipboard. "How are you feeling?" Eleanor tapped her temple. "Less dizzy. Tired, but better." Then she pointed to the chair. "Sit, tell me about your day." Clara hesitated. Nurses weren't supposed to linger. There were charts to update, meds to pass, other patients to check on. But something in Eleanor's eyes, the same loneliness Clara recognized from her own reflection sometimes, made her sit down. She didn't talk about her day. Instead, she asked about Eleanor's garden. The night before, Eleanor had mentioned roses. Now, with animated hands, she described how she used to prune them every spring, how the scent would fill the whole yard, how her late husband would bring her a single bloom every morning on his way to work. Clara listened, nodding, asking gentle questions. She signed slowly, making sure Eleanor could follow, but also letting the conversation breathe. There was no rush, no performance, just two people sharing a quiet moment in a world that rarely slowed down. What neither of them knew was that someone was watching again. From the far end of the hallway, Just beyond the nurse's station, a figure stood in the dim light near the supply closet. He wore the same dark coat, the same baseball cap pulled low. He hadn't planned to come back so soon. He'd told himself he'd wait, give his mother space, let the doctors do their work. But he couldn't stop thinking about what he'd seen. So he'd driven back, parked 3 blocks away this time, walked in through the loading dock entrance where no one asked questions. He'd asked a janitor for room 314, then stood there hidden in the shadows, watching through the narrow window in the door. He saw Clara lean forward as Eleanor signed something funny, her shoulders shaking with silent laughter. He saw Clara mimic a rose blooming with her hands and how Eleanor clapped softly in delight. He saw the way Clara adjusted the blanket around Eleanor's shoulders without being asked, how she checked the IV not like a task, but like a promise. It wasn't pity. It wasn't duty. It was care. Real, unguarded human care. And it wrecked him. He'd spent years building a reputation for being untouchable. In boardrooms, he was known for cutting through emotion like it was noise. He'd fired executives mid-sentence. He'd walked away from billion-dollar deals because someone wasted his time. People said he had ice in his veins. Maybe they were right, but standing there, watching a nurse who probably made less in a year than he spent on coffee, he felt something unfamiliar. Shame. Because he knew, deep in his gut, that he hadn't been this present for his own mother in over a decade. He remembered her trying to teach him sign language when he was 10. He'd rolled his eyes, called it weird, and begged to go to soccer practice instead. She'd stopped asking after that, and he'd never thought about it again until now. He wanted to walk in, to thank Clara, to sit beside his mother and try to remember how to sign "I'm sorry," but fear held him back. What if she didn't want to see him? What if Clara thought he was just showing up for show? What if he messed it up? So he stayed hidden, watching, memorizing the way Clara's hands moved, like they were speaking a language older than words. Back in the room, Clara stood to leave after 20 minutes. Eleanor reached out and squeezed her hand. "You remind me of my daughter." She signed slowly. Clara paused. "You have a daughter?" She asked aloud, then quickly corrected herself in sign. Eleanor's expression softened. Had she passed a long time ago? Car accident. She was, like you, quiet, kind, saw people others ignored. Clara's throat tightened. She didn't know what to say. So she just squeezed Eleanor's hand back and signed, "I'm glad I can be here for you." Eleanor nodded, her eyes glistening. "Me too." Clara left the room, her heart heavier than when she'd entered. She walked down the hall, lost in thought, and didn't notice the man slipping away down the stairwell just as she passed. Over the next few nights, the pattern repeated. Clara checked on Eleanor every shift. They talked about books, old movies, the way hospitals always smelled like antiseptic and regret. Eleanor started saving little things to tell Clara, like how the sunrise looked from her window or a funny dream she'd had. Clara brought her a small notebook so they could write down words when signs failed them, but mostly they didn't need it. And every night, without fail, the man in the coat returned. He never stayed long. Never knocked, just watched for a few minutes, then vanished. Sometimes he'd stand so still he could have been part of the wall. Other times he'd pace quietly, hands in his pockets, jaw tight. Once, a nurse almost caught him and he ducked into a storage room until she passed. He started carrying a small notebook of his own. In it, he scribbled clumsy drawings of hand shapes A, B, C, and next to them the English words in "Hello, thank you, mother, sorry." He practiced in his car. In his empty office at 2 a.m. in the mirror, frowning at his own stiff fingers. It felt ridiculous at first. He was used to commanding rooms, not fumbling over basic signs. But every time he got frustrated, he'd remember Clara's hands, how they moved like they were dancing, and he'd try again. One night, he stayed longer than usual. Clara had just left Eleanor's room and the hallway was empty. He took a deep breath and stepped closer to the door. He raised his hand ready to knock but froze when he heard Eleanor's voice. Soft but clear. "Julian?" she said out loud, her voice rough from disuse. He froze. She hadn't seen him. She couldn't have. But somehow she knew. He didn't answer. "Couldn't." "I know you're out there," she said, turning toward the door. "You always did hover like a ghost." His chest ached. He wanted to run, but then he thought of Clara's kindness and how he owed it to his mother, and maybe to himself, to stop hiding. Slowly, he pushed the door open. Eleanor didn't look surprised. She just studied him, her eyes sharp despite her age. "You look tired," she signed. He swallowed hard. His hands trembled as he tried to form the sign for Mom. It came out wrong, too stiff, too slow, but she understood. Tears filled her eyes. Not angry tears. Not sad ones. Just full ones, like her heart had been waiting for this moment for years. He stepped inside and closed the door. "I'm sorry," he whispered, voice cracking. Then haltingly he signed the same words. Eleanor reached out. He took her hand. And for the first time in a long time, neither of them let go. Outside, the hospital carried on. Beeping machines, shuffling feet, the distant wail of an ambulance. But in room 314, something quiet and powerful was being rebuilt, one shaky sign at a time, and though Clara didn't know it yet, her simple act of greeting a stranger in her own language had done more than comfort an elderly woman. It had pulled a lost son back home. She'd go on with her shift, unaware of the reunion happening just down the hall. But the ripple she'd started was already growing, softly, surely, like dawn after a long night. Clara's shift had been rough. One of the older patients had spiked a fever. Another had fallen trying to get to the bathroom, and the new electronic charting system kept glitching. By the time she finished her last round, her feet ached and her eyes felt gritty from lack of sleep. All she wanted was to clock out, grab a coffee from the gas station down the street, and collapse into bed. But as she walked past the nurse's station on her way to the time clock, the charge nurse waved her over. "Hey, you're needed in the admin office," she said, not looking up from her screen. "Mr. Whitmore's here." Clara's stomach dropped. She hadn't seen Eleanor's son since that first night, though she'd heard whispers. Apparently, he'd been visiting every evening, staying for hours, even bringing his laptop and working from the hospital cafeteria. Some of the night staff joked that he was scouting the place for a takeover. Others said he'd donated a small fortune to upgrade the cardiac wing. Clara hadn't paid much attention. She figured he was just doing what rich people did, show up, write a check, disappear. But now he wanted to see her. Her mind raced. Had she done something wrong? Maybe she'd missed a dosage entry. Or maybe Eleanor had complained, though that didn't make sense. They'd been getting along fine. She smoothed her scrubs and walked down the hall, her pulse thudding in her ears. The admin office was quiet, the blinds half closed against the morning sun. Inside, a man stood by the window, back turned. He wore a crisp shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, no tie. When he turned, Clara recognized him instantly, not from tabloids or news clips, but from the way he carried himself. Calm, focused, like the whole room bent around him. He looked nothing like the cold, distant CEO people described. His eyes were tired. His shoulders weren't stiff with arrogance, but slumped with something heavier, like relief or maybe regret. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice lower than she expected. "I'm Julian Whitmore." Clara nodded, suddenly aware of how messy her hair was, how her shoes squeaked on the linoleum. I didn't know you wanted to see me." "I didn't plan to," he admitted. "But I couldn't leave without saying this in person." He paused, then stepped closer. "What you've done for my mother." "It's more than I can put into words," Clara blinked. "I just did my job." "No," he said gently. "You did more than that. You saw her. Not as a patient. Not as my mother, just as herself." Clara didn't know what to say. She looked down at her hands, still stained with ink from charting. "She's a lovely woman, and she's been so lonely." "She has," he said quietly. "And I'm ashamed to admit I didn't realize how much until I saw the way she lit up when you walked in." He took a breath. "I'd like to do something. For you. For the hospital. Whatever you need." Clara stiffened. This was the part she'd feared. The offer of money, the grand gesture that would make her feel like a charity case. She'd seen it before. Rich families thanking nurses with gift cards or donations in their name, as if kindness could be balanced on a ledger. "I don't want anything for myself," she said carefully. "But if you really want to help, St. Marlo's could use better support for deaf and hard of hearing patients. We don't have interpreters on staff. Most of us don't know sign language. People like your mom, they get lost in the system." Julian listened, really listened, not nodding just to be polite, but absorbing every word. When she finished, he didn't jump in with a solution. He just said, "Tell me more," so she did. She told him about the elderly man last month who missed his discharge instructions because no one could communicate with him. About the teenage girl who cried in the ER because the doctors kept shouting at her like that would help. About how frustrating it was to know there was a whole world of people slipping through the cracks, not because anyone was cruel, but because no one had been trained to reach them. Julian's expression changed as she spoke. It wasn't pity. It was understanding. And something else, determination. I had no idea, he said. I thought hiring private caregivers meant she was covered. But that's not the same as being seen. He paced slowly, then stopped. What if we built something here? A dedicated unit, trained staff, on-call interpreters, visual alert systems. A place designed from the ground up for deaf patients. Clara's eyes widened. That would be incredible. But it would cost a lot. I can handle the cost, he said simply. But I don't want to just drop money and walk away. I want it done right. And I think you should help design it. Clara stared at him. Me? I'm just a nurse. You're the only person who's shown my mother real kindness in years, he said. That's not just anything. She felt a lump in her throat. No one had ever spoken to her like that. Not with that kind of respect, that kind of trust. But I don't know anything about building programs, she said honestly. You know what matters, he replied. That's the hardest part to teach. They talked for nearly an hour. About staffing, about training, about making sure the program wasn't just a showpiece but something real, something lasting. Clara found herself relaxing, even smiling once or twice. He wasn't trying to impress her. He was trying to learn. Before she left, he handed her a plain envelope. No donation, he said quickly, seeing her hesitation. Just my direct number. If you have ideas, questions, or if my mother needs anything, even if it's 3 a.m, call me. Clara took it, surprised by how ordinary it felt. Just paper. Just a phone number. Thank you, she said. No, he said. Thank you. You reminded me what I'd forgotten. That people aren't problems to solve. They're people to care for. She walked out of the office feeling lighter than she had in days. Not because of the offer, but because for the first time, someone had asked for her opinion. Not as a nurse filling a role, but as a human being with something valuable to say. Over the next week, things changed slowly but surely. Eleanor's condition improved enough that she was cleared for discharge. Julian came by every day, always signing now, still clumsy but trying. Clara watched from a distance as he helped his mother pack, as they shared quiet laughs over old photo albums he'd brought from home. One afternoon, as Clara was restocking supplies in the hallway, Julian approached her. She wants to say goodbye, he signed, his movements still stiff, but clear. Clara followed him to room 314. Eleanor was dressed in her own clothes, a light shawl around her shoulders. She stood when Clara entered and walked straight to her, pulling her into a hug. You've been a gift. Eleanor signed when they pulled apart, her eyes bright. You've been good for me too. Clara signed back. Eleanor took her hands. Promise you'll visit? Clara hesitated. She didn't want to overstep. But then she thought of the garden Eleanor had described, the roses, the quiet mornings. If you'll have me, she said aloud, then signed the same. Eleanor beamed. Julian stood by the door watching them. When it was time to go, he turned to Clara. About the program, he said. I've already spoken to the hospital board. They're on board. I'd like you to meet with our team next week just to talk through your vision. Clara nodded. Okay. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened. You're going to change a lot of lives. I just want to make sure no one feels invisible, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then you already have. As they left, Clara stood in the empty room, listening to the echo of their footsteps fade down the hall. She thought about how strange life was, how one quiet moment, one choice to use her hands instead of a pen had led to this. She didn't know what would come next. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she belonged exactly where she was, right in the middle of something that mattered. The first meeting took place in a sleek conference room on the top floor of a downtown tower. Glass walls, city skyline stretching in every direction, chairs so expensive they probably cost more than Clara's monthly rent. She'd worn her best slacks and a blouse she'd ironed twice, but still felt out of place among the designers, architects, and executives who spoke in acronyms and tossed around words like scalable and user-centric, like they were everyday greetings. Julian was there, but he didn't sit at the head of the table like she expected. He pulled out the chair beside her and sat down quietly, nodding as if to say, "You're not alone here." The project had a name now, Haven Access. Not flashy, not corporate-sounding, just simple like the idea itself. The goal was to redesign a wing of St. Marlo's specifically for deaf and hard-of-hearing patients, but also to create a model that could be copied in other hospitals. Clara's role wasn't official on paper. She wasn't a consultant or a director, but everyone in the room treated her like she was the heart of the whole thing. At first, she barely spoke. She listened as people debated lighting. Too bright could cause glare for those who relied on lip reading. Flooring, carpet-absorbed sound but hard floors helped vibrations for those who felt sound through their feet. And alert systems, flashing lights instead of beeping alarms. It was overwhelming. But then someone suggested using only written instructions at check-in, and Clara finally raised her hand. "Written notes don't work for everyone," she said, her voice quieter than she wanted. "Some deaf people use sign as their first language. Reading English can be like reading a foreign language for them." The room went still for a second. Then Julian turned to her. "What would work better?" She took a breath. "Video remote interpreters right at intake. And staff trained in basic ASL, not just for medical terms, but for things like, 'Are you in pain?' Or 'Would you like water?' It's not about fluency. It's about respect." One of the designers scribbled notes. Another asked thoughtful questions. No one dismissed her. No one talked over her. And when the meeting ended, Julian walked her to the elevator. "You were amazing," he said. "I just said what I've seen," she replied. "That's the point," he said. "You've lived it. That's worth more than any report." After that, the meetings became less intimidating. Clara started speaking up more. About how waiting rooms should have clear sightlines so people could see who was signing. About how privacy curtains should be transparent at eye level. About how even small things like staff name tags with ASL badges could make patients feel safer. She brought in a deaf community advocate she knew from volunteering, and together they shaped policies that felt real, not just theoretical. Outside the meetings, life kept moving. Clara still worked her night shifts. She still made coffee that tasted like burnt socks in the break room. She still felt shy when new doctors barked orders at her, but something had shifted inside her. She walked a little taller. She trusted her instincts more, and then, one rainy Thursday, Julian showed up at the hospital, not in a suit but in a sweater and jeans, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. "I thought you might need this," he said, handing her one. "Black, 1 sugar, right?" She stared at him. "You remembered?" "I pay attention," he said simply. They stood in the dim hallway near the supply closet, sipping coffee in comfortable silence. For the first time, it didn't feel like CEO and nurse. It felt like 2 people who'd been through something together. "How's your mom?" Clara asked. "Better," he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "She's teaching me signs again. Real ones, not just hello and thank you. Yesterday, she taught me how to sign stubborn." He chuckled. "I think it was a joke." Clara laughed, really laughed. "It felt good. She asks about you," he added quietly. "Every day." Clara looked down at her cup. "I've been meaning to visit, just haven't known how to reach out." "You don't need permission," he said. "She's your friend, not just my mother." The words settled in her chest like something warm. Over the next few weeks, their paths crossed more often, not by accident but by quiet intention. He'd stop by after a late meeting. She'd text him a question about lighting specs, and he'd call instead of replying. They never talked about anything personal. No childhood stories, no relationship histories, no deep confessions. But they didn't need to. They were building something together, and that created its own kind of closeness. Then came the day Clara walked into the hospital and found a group of staff gathered near the bulletin board. Someone had posted a news article. Tech billionaire partners with local nurse to revolutionize hospital accessibility. Her stomach dropped. The headline was dramatic, but the article itself was respectful, focusing on the program, not her. Still, her photo was there, small but clear, taken during a site walkthrough. She hated seeing herself like that, frozen, awkward, like she was playing a role. By lunch, people were treating her differently. The day shift nurses smiled too wide. A doctor she barely knew clapped her on the back and said, Look at you, famous. Even the cafeteria lady gave her an extra cookie. She felt exposed. Like her quiet life had been pulled into the spotlight without her consent. That evening, Julian found her sitting alone in the break room, head in her hands. I saw the article, he said gently, sitting across from her. I didn't agree to that, she said, voice tight. I know, he replied. I told the PR team no photos, no names. Someone didn't listen. She looked up. Why does it always have to be a story? Can't we just do the work? He nodded. We can. And we will. I've already pulled the article. And I've made it clear. No more press until you say so. She studied his face. There was no defensiveness, no corporate spin. Just regret. Thank you, she said. He hesitated. I'm sorry I didn't protect that for you. She shook her head. You're trying. That's more than most. They sat in silence for a while, the hum of the vending machine filling the space between them. Later that week, Clara visited Eleanor's house for the first time. It was a modest home with a wraparound porch and, just as she'd described, a garden bursting with roses. Eleanor greeted her at the door with a hug and a tray of tea. They sat on the porch, signing slowly in the afternoon sun, talking about nothing and everything. Julian joined them later, carrying a tray of cookies he'd clearly bought from the store but pretended to have baked. He fumbled through signs, making Eleanor laugh. Clara watched them, mother and son rebuilding something broken, and felt a quiet joy she hadn't expected. On the drive back, Julian asked, Do you ever wonder if this is too big? What we're trying to do? Clara thought about it. I used to. But then I remember the man who missed his meds because no one could tell him when to take them, or the girl who cried because she thought the doctors were yelling at her. If we can fix even one of those moments, it's worth it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, You remind me that change doesn't have to be loud. Sometimes it's just one person choosing to care. She smiled. Sometimes that's enough. And in that moment, under the fading light of a city sky, it really did feel like enough. The launch day arrived on a crisp spring morning, the kind where the air smells like blooming trees and fresh pavement. St. Marlo's Hospital looked different, cleaner, brighter, like it had taken a deep breath and stood a little taller. A new wing stretched along the east side, its entrance marked by a simple wooden sign with raised letters and a subtle symbol. 2 hands forming a heart in ASL. Inside, everything had been rethought. The reception desk faced the door so patients could see who was signing. Lights were soft but clear, walls painted in calming blues and greens that didn't glare. Every room had a visual alert system, gentle pulses of light for calls, doorbells, emergencies. Even the hand sanitizer dispensers made a soft vibration when used, so deaf patients wouldn't miss the sound cue others relied on. Clara stood near the back of the room, arms crossed, heart pounding. She wore a simple dress, nothing fancy, just clean and comfortable, and kept glancing at the clock. She hadn't wanted to come, not because she didn't care, but because she hated being the center of attention. But Julian had called the night before, voice quiet but firm. Please be there, he'd said. This is yours too. Now, as guests filed in, hospital staff, city officials, members of the deaf community, even a few reporters with strict instructions. No flash photography, no shouting. Clara felt both proud and exposed, like someone had opened a window into her private world. Julian stood at the front, dressed in a dark suit but no tie, looking more nervous than she'd ever seen him. When it was time to speak, he didn't step behind a podium. He just stood in the center of the room and began to sign. His movements were still a little stiff but clear. A certified interpreter stood beside him, voicing his words for those who didn't sign. This wing isn't about technology, he signed. It's about dignity. For too long, people who are deaf or hard of hearing have been asked to fit into a world that wasn't built for them. Today we say you don't have to shrink yourself to be seen. You belong here exactly as you are. A ripple of quiet applause moved through the room. Hands raised, palms fluttering. The deaf community's way of showing joy. Then he turned and looked directly at Clara. None of this would exist without someone who chose kindness over convenience. Someone who saw a patient not as a chart but as a person. She didn't ask for credit. She didn't want fame. She just did what was right. He paused, then signed slowly, deliberately. Thank you for seeing us both. Clara's eyes filled with tears. She hadn't expected this. She stepped forward, not to the mic, but just enough so he could see her. She raised her hands and signed back, clear and calm. Everyone deserves to be understood. The room fell silent for a heartbeat. Then the applause returned, stronger this time, warmer. After the speeches, people wandered through the new wing, touching the textured walls, testing the alert lights, chatting with staff who now wore small pins showing their ASL skill level, basic, intermediate, fluent. A young girl, maybe 10 years old, ran her fingers over the braille labels next to the light switches and turned to her mother, signing excitedly. Her mother hugged her, tears in her eyes. Clara watched it all from the hallway, unnoticed. This was what mattered. Not the speeches, not the cameras, but this. A child feeling safe in a hospital for the first time. Later, as the crowd thinned, Julian found her near the garden courtyard, a small space they'd added with benches and flowering shrubs, inspired by Eleanor's roses. "You disappeared," he said, handing her a bottle of water. "I just needed a minute," she said. "It's a lot," he nodded. "I almost didn't do any of this, you know. For years I thought changing the world meant building faster phones or smarter software. But you showed me that real change starts with how we treat one another." She looked at him. "You did the hard part, listening." He smiled faintly. "I'm still learning." They sat on a bench in comfortable silence. Birds chirped. A breeze carried the scent of jasmine from the planters. Eleanor joined them a few minutes later, leaning on a cane but standing tall. She signed to Clara, "Proud of you." Clara shook her head. "We did it together." Eleanor reached out and squeezed her hand. Then she turned to her son and signed something quick and playful. He laughed, a real, unguarded laugh, and signed back, "I know, Mom, I'm trying." As the sun dipped lower, casting long golden shadows, Clara realized something. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. The Haven Access Wing would open its doors the following week. Hospitals in 3 other cities had already reached out, asking how to replicate the model. And Clara had agreed to help, not as a spokesperson, but as a guide, sharing what worked, what didn't, what mattered most. She still worked nights at St. Marlo's, still drank bad coffee, still felt shy in big groups, but now, when she walked the halls, patients smiled when they saw her. Staff asked her opinion, and sometimes when a new deaf patient arrived, they'd look at her and sign, "You're the one who made this happen?" And she'd just smile and sign back. We all did. On the drive home that evening, Clara rolled down her window and let the cool air rush in. She thought about her grandmother, about how she'd practiced signs under the kitchen light all those years ago, never imagining they'd lead to this. She thought about Eleanor finally feeling seen. She thought about Julian, who'd let his walls down just enough to let someone in. None of it had been planned. None of it had been grand. It had started with a simple greeting, hands moving in the quiet of a hospital room saying hello when the world had gone silent. And that was enough. Back at her apartment, she made tea and sat by the window. The city hummed below, cars, voices, life moving forward. She didn't feel small anymore. Not because she'd been on a stage or in a news article, but because she'd helped build something that would outlast her, something quiet, kind, and true. Later that week, she visited Eleanor again. They sat in the garden, pruning roses, hands moving in the language they both loved. Julian joined them, fumbling through signs but trying. No one rushed. No one performed. They just were. 3 people connected by a moment of kindness that had grown into something real. And in that garden, under the wide open sky, Clara knew she'd found exactly where she belonged, not in the spotlight, but in the spaces between people, where understanding grows like a quiet bloom, one sign at a time. It had been nearly a year since the Haven Access Wing opened, and the quiet hum of change had settled into something steady, something real. Clara still worked nights at St. Marlo's, but now her rounds often included stopping by the new wing, not to check on patients as a nurse, but to listen, to learn, to see how the design held up in everyday life. Sometimes she'd find a young intern practicing signs with an elderly patient. Other times she'd watch a parent relax for the first time since arriving, finally able to communicate with their child without shouting or scribbling notes. The program had grown beyond what anyone expected, not just in size but in spirit. Staff from other departments started showing up for free ASL classes during lunch breaks. The hospital cafeteria added visual menu boards, Even the security team learned basic signs for help, stop, and it's okay. It wasn't perfect. There were still missteps. Still days when the video interpreter system glitched, but the effort was there. And that made all the difference. Clara had also started something small on her own. A monthly gathering in the hospital's community room for deaf patients, families, and staff. No agenda, no presentations. Just tea, cookies, and conversation in whatever language felt right. Sign, speech, writing, or silence. People came from all over the city. Some had never met another deaf person their age. Others just wanted to sit in a room where they didn't have to explain themselves. One evening, as she was setting out cups, a woman approached her, mid-50s, silver streaks in her hair, hands moving with quiet confidence. "You're the nurse," she signed. "The one who started this." Clara shook her head. "I didn't start it. I just helped open the door." The woman smiled. "Sometimes that's the hardest part." They talked for a while. The woman shared how her son, who was deaf, had been misdiagnosed twice because doctors assumed he couldn't describe his pain. "Now," she signed, eyes bright, "he comes here. They see him. Not his ears, him." Clara felt that familiar warmth in her chest, the kind that came not from praise but from knowing something mattered. Later that week, Julian called. Not about the program, not about meetings or budgets, just to say his mother had taken her first solo walk through the garden in years. Cane in one hand, pruning shears in the other, humming a tune only she could hear. "She says it's because she finally feels strong again," he said. "I think it's because she feels loved." Clara didn't say much. She just listened. And for the first time, their calls didn't feel like check-ins. They felt like friendship, quiet, steady, built on shared purpose rather than expectation. Then came the letter. It arrived in a plain envelope. No return address. Just her name and the hospital's address written in careful script. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small folded photograph. The note read, "Thank you for seeing me when no one else did. Eleanor." The photo showed Eleanor and Clara on the hospital porch last spring, both laughing, hands mid-sign. Someone, probably Julian, had captured it without either of them noticing. Clara stared at it for a long time. She'd forgotten that moment. But here it was, frozen in time, two people, different in age and experience, connected by a language that needed no sound. She tucked the photo into the notebook she kept by her bed, the one filled with sketches of hand shapes, patient notes, and little reminders like, "Ask about visual alarms in pediatrics," or "Bring extra cookies to community night." Life went on. Seasons turned. The roses in Eleanor's garden bloomed again. And Clara kept showing up, not for glory, not for recognition, but because someone once taught her that kindness isn't a grand gesture. It's a choice you make again and again, even when no one's watching. One rainy afternoon, as she was leaving the hospital after a long shift, she saw a young man standing under the awning, drenched, holding a crumpled piece of paper. He looked lost. When he saw her scrubs, he hesitated, then stepped forward. He didn't speak. Instead, he pointed to his ear and shook his head. "I'm deaf," then held out the paper. It was a referral slip for the cardiology department. Clara didn't reach for her phone to type. She didn't call for help. She just smiled, raised her hands, and signed, "Welcome. I'll take you there." His shoulders dropped in relief. He signed back, awkward but clear, "Thank you." And just like that, the circle continued, no fanfare. No cameras. Just one person reaching out to another in the quiet language of care. Later, as she walked home through the drizzle, Clara thought about how strange it was that something so small, a few signs in a hospital room, could ripple outward like this. It hadn't changed the world in a loud way. There were no headlines, no viral videos, but it had changed lives. Hers, Eleanor's, Julian's. Dozens of patients who no longer felt invisible. And maybe that was enough. Because real change rarely arrives with trumpets. It slips in through open doors, carried in the hands of ordinary people who choose to see each other, not as problems to fix, but as humans to honor. Back at her apartment, she made a cup of tea and sat by the window. The city lights shimmered through the rain. Somewhere out there, a deaf teenager was getting clear instructions before surgery. A grandmother was signing goodnight to her grandson over a hospital bed. A CEO was practicing signs in his office not for show, but because he finally understood what mattered. And Clara? She was just a nurse. Quiet, kind, present. But in a world that often shouts to be heard, sometimes the softest voices make the deepest impact. She turned off the lamp, letting the glow of the streetlights fill the room. Outside, the rain slowed to a whisper. Inside, everything was calm, and for the first time in a long time, she felt completely at peace, not because everything was perfect, but because she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be, in the quiet spaces between people, helping them find their way back to each other. One sign, one smile, one act of kindness at a time.